the SCI Guys, the show where we talk about the crazy, weird, and wonderful stories from the science world. I'm Corey, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Luke Cutford, and this week's special guest, Elliot Douglas.
Hey!
Hello! This week, we're talking about BPD. Couldn't think of a joke, so BPD. But first, we've got an Apple review.
Ooh.
A wee review. This one says, love this podcast. It's 5 stars. And it goes on to say, I love the SCI Guys podcast. So educational, fun, and generally awesome. I just remembered this podcast and I've been listening to it all day. Love it. Love you guys. Have a great day.
Thanks for reading out my review.
Are you vegan Oh, it could be you. I've also got a question for anyone who's watching or listening at home. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify or anywhere else where you listen to podcasts, head down to the YouTube and get to the comments and answer this question. The question is, do you have BPD?
As far as I know, no.
Yes.
Ooh.
Wow. Is that why you're here?
That's
that
lucky.
might be why I'm here.
Well, I mean, I guess if we want to start off the episode with another question, what is BPD? Anyone know? I don't know.
I know what it stands for.
What does it stand for?
BPD stands for borderline personality disorder.
Ah, very
And
good.
it also can have another name, but I mean, you're the educator here.
Oh,
So
yeah, I think it does have another name not in the DSM-5, the other one, but I'm not really going to be talking about that today
no.
because
Because the other name is not particularly nice. It's EUPD, which my friends and I used to go ooped. But like, ooped, which stands for emotionally unstable personality disorder, which doesn't sound very nice. It's like
No, it's nice. Borderline is cool. It's like borderline.
Yeah.
What does that
Yeah.
mean? Who knows?
Yeah, the other one's a lot more judgy.
yeah,
Very judgy.
So yeah, I mean, what is BPD? Borderline personality disorder. Obviously, it's a type of personality disorder, says the NHS. They love to repeat themselves there, don't they? Now, do you know what personality disorder is? Either of you?
Interesting. I'll hazard a guess. Is it? You know, I love to wing it on this podcast. What is a Well, let's
Are
start
you
with...
stalling for time? There is no pressure to answer.
No.
Okay.
I was just thought I'd hazard a guess. Well, personality, I would say, is like sort of a rough sort of presenting of your sort of style in life, and the disorder would be like where your sort of style in life just sort of changes quite a bit, and it's not very stable.
So
I mean, I tried.
the NHS says that you might be diagnosed with a personality disorder if you have difficulties with how you think and feel about yourself and other people, and if then those difficulties make it hard to go through day-to-day life.
Yeah,
The
DSM-5
classic.
standard.
The classic. You do a thing that's different from other people, and it's upsetting you. You have a disorder. There you go.
there we go.
I looked at you when I said
No,
that. I'm sorry. So obviously different people can experience BPD differently because that's just how things work, isn't it? And you could have intense emotions, overwhelming or very sort of changeable emotions. That's kind of what the borderline there means, rather. Because I mean, when you hear borderline personality disorder, it doesn't make a lot of obvious sense, right? Or maybe it's just me.
It makes me want to know what personality disorder is. Like, if you're like on the borderline...
I think
It's like the borderline is like this descriptive, like, you have a personality disorder and it's a borderline. Do you know what I'm...
you have a borderline personality, and that's a disorder.
Okay.
It's not
that you're like you're right on the border between
No.
standard personality and real personality disorder. So you're like right on that. You're right on the edge.
That is not what
Sorry,
it means.
I'm,
it makes sense.
I'm making fun of myself because that's what I thought it meant this whole time.
No, do you know what? That's perfectly fine, and that's exactly my point here. That borderline personality disorder, to me, is not a very intuitive name. It doesn't tell you what it is. It's not like bipolar disorder or depression or anxiety or being gay. I don't know. They all tell you what they are on the tin, right? They were all in the DSM-5, so I can bring them all up as examples. Okay,
Yeah.
You got a problem with that? You take it up with Dr. SM5.
What other things were in the DSM-5 that probably shouldn't have been there now that we've sort of grown up a bit?
Women, just in general. No, we're not.
Yeah, they were actually, weren't they? Having a womb.
So back to BPD though. Basically, if you have sort of problems with sort of regulating your emotions or feeling emotions that are very intense, interpersonal problems, sort of caused by that, so your relationships with other people are sort of put to a sense of strain. because of that sort of really intense or changeable emotion that you're experiencing.
Just from personal experience, the types of things that you experience can kind of feel a bit like irrational, like you've got no reason to feel as intensely as you do, right? And so not only is it like does it put strain on the relationship for the other person, or like, you know what I mean, like it can also kind of be stressful for you, because it's just like no one gets what it feels like for you, like how intense it can be. I feel like everyone has their own ways of understanding things, but just what you singularly go through can be really difficult on the other end of that too.
So when you're saying irrational there, are you saying that to yourself experiencing the emotion,
it seems irrational, you know, like
it seems
like,
irrational to other people? Or internally.
Okay.
No, I'm just curious as to which one you're saying.
No, like it will seem irrational to other people. Then, fair, like fair. You know, like why did the way that something happened? Like I don't know, maybe. I don't know. I think I get what you mean. Explain, but like, say, I don't know. I don't like Luke's jumper, and that really upsets me, or something. Yeah. You know, it feels like a irrational thing to be getting upset about.
This is kind of making me think a little bit of autism as well, because not to say that they're similar in many ways, but just that sort of, it seems irrational to an outside observer, because they're not in your head and experiencing what you're experiencing. And obviously, like, all emotions are about as rational or irrational as each other, but like without that sort of empathy or being in someone else's head, it's hard to understand it.
But okay, not now. Don't bring my jumper into this. Okay,
it's a lovely jumper.
You've said what you said. You can't take it back.
It is the most neutral. I mean, it's a jumper.
Anyway, so what I'm asking, I think like what I think Corey was getting at is that if you're saying, for example, you gave the example, I don't like Luke's jumper. That from the external perspective is like, oh, that's an irrational response. But is there, from the subjective experience, from your experience, is there an internal rationality to why you don't like the jumper, or is the experience also irrational to you?
That's an interesting question. I think like it really depends. Depends kind of what it is. You know, sometimes like if I think about maybe it's something that like triggers me, like maybe it's like not a fight or flight response, but like something that brings up a strong emotion. Sometimes I will have to unpack why I felt the way I did about that thing, and really like some things require a lot of reflection and processing and going, okay, how do I rationalize or like make sense of this, you know? And then other times it's just like, I don't know why I felt like that, or you know, like, I don't know how to but yeah, I think that kind of answers your question.
I think it does.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if I'm understanding, it's sort of a case of you feel feelings, and sometimes when you work through those, you can understand, this is why I felt feeling.
When you get into it a bit more, I'd like to talk about the things that have helped me with my BPD, like, significantly.
Oh, definitely.
I'm also aware that you probably have loads of information.
Do you know what? What's really interesting to me is that when it comes to the NHS advice, because that's what I really like to do with these sort of episodes, just go to the NHS, go to Mind, go to, you know, a few different sort of public health people.
Good sources that you can trust.
Yeah, and see what they're... Because, I mean, think about it this way. What I like to do is to look and see, okay, well, if I found out that I had BPD, I would search this. I would go to the NHS and see what they're saying. I find it interesting to see, you know, to share that with others. You know, because it gives you an idea of what people are learning. And the NHS has a lot of information on sort of treatment or management of BPD, and we'll get into that in a bit. But so surveys have estimated apparently that BPD affects roughly about 1.6% of the general population and 20% of people who are in inpatient psychiatric inpatient sort of psychiatric facilities, right? So that's like a massive jump up there, right? From 1.6 to 20%. So just looking back through history a little bit, Adolf Stern in 1938 came up with the term borderline personality. So he used it basically talking about a group of patients who their conditions worsened during therapy and who showed masochistic behavior and psychic rigidity, indicating a protective mechanism against any perceived changes in the environment or within the individual. And then it was expanded in the 60s and 70s, and then the diagnosis was used in sort of empirical studies, and then it was added to the DSM sort of 3, 4, and updated for the DSM-5. So that kind of gives you an overview, I guess, of just generally what BPD is, the sort of history of it. But let's get stuck into the sort of signs and symptoms of it. So this is something I didn't know going in. I mean, I know that I know people with BPD. I've never bothered to look into what BPD is. I'm like, I'll get to it at some point. But yeah, I mean, according to the NHS, you can group BPD symptoms into 4 main areas. So emotional instability, disturbed patterns of thinking or perception, impulsive behavior, and intense but unstable relationships with others. The thing with personality disorders is that the symptoms might just change from mild to strong depending on the day, or I mean, it's not a consistent thing all the time necessarily, and it says here that they usually come about during adolescence, so when you're sort of a teenager, that sort of age, and they last through into adulthood. So just to run through those quickly again: emotional instability, that is otherwise known as affective dysregulation, and there's cognitive distortions or perceptual distortions. That's disturbed patterns of thinking or perception. We've obviously got, again, impulsive behavior and intense but unstable relationships with others.
That's really hard. Because that feels like you couldn't...
It affects every part of your life so easily. Like, yeah, even just hearing those 4 categories read back to me reminded me of when I was doing my DBT for the first time. And, like, I didn't understand it. I didn't understand what they were trying to get at.
It's interesting, though, as well, because... we talk about mood disorders before, like depression, like sort of anxiety, that sort of thing. Personality disorders. I think we may have covered a couple personality disorders before, but also neurodivergence as well. And the interesting thing with all of those is that if you're living in your own head and your own experience, it's very difficult to conceptualize someone outside of that.
It just feels like the first thing you'd have to understand is, I just can't trust my perceptions.
Which is...
like, that's terrifying.
Scary.
It's like you're looking through a periscope and you're in a submarine and you're looking through a periscope, and every so often the periscope just shows you a shark, and then you actually look out and there's not a shark there a load of the time, and then someone just turns to you and goes, "Oh yeah, you just have to like not really trust what that periscope says, even though there's like a big scary shark there. You have to just sort of ignore it. That periscope just sort of just shows sharks sometimes, and we don't know why, and we don't really know what to do about it." What? How do I exist on this submarine then? What do I do?
I really like the way that you describe that. I don't know if metaphor is the right word, but like just, yeah.
Well, look, we just generally feel like we can trust our perceptions, and one of the things in general therapy.
When you say perceptions, is that like, I know this might sound like dumb, but I like asking questions so I understand things better. When you say like trust our perceptions, what do you mean exactly?
So like, for example, I don't know what it's like to live with BPD, but for example, if you were having a conversation with someone and you perceived them to be antagonistic, or you perceived them to be angry, or you perceived them to be...
what, like through reading like tone? Or like...
Yeah.
Or do you just mean as in like... You're like, okay, this person in front of me is angry.
Take, for example, just like someone says something and that triggers something in you. And because you don't know necessarily what it's triggered or why that's there, you sort of put it on what the person said and you go, oh, that person said that to make that. They wanted me to feel like that.
Something that I really was like a massive healing moment for me recently is I managed to tell myself I felt safe for the first time. I was like, oh my gosh, I don't need to be in a constant defense mode, especially with people that and it sounds very weird, but like actually the people that I'm very close to. So like my partner, I can be in a defense with him sometimes, and I'm like, why? Like he's literally there to love and support me, but I feel like I think a lot of I might be wrong, and I don't want to speak for everyone that has BPD, but I feel like if you went through some really, am I allowed to swear?
Go for it, yeah.
If you had some really shit times as a kid, like that's often why BPD can come about, because it's to do with the development of your brain and stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so like these things that are just innate to you, like almost habitual, are like something that you're always used to doing. So like having that defense mechanism is something that I've been so used to, and I've realized I'm safe. I should feel comfortable, like I'm allowed to feel comfortable in my work, in my home, in my whatever.
But that's what I mean.
But
that's what I mean by perception.
Taken a very long time to get there. But yeah, sorry, can't.
Is it the idea that sort of like, I mean, you feel this is me trying to understand what you're saying. So you feel a feeling, right?
Yeah.
So everyone, we feel feelings, and when you feel a feeling, let's say I'm talking to Luke and then suddenly I start to feel really negative, right? Like I feel like really upset. The automatic sort of thing there is to think Luke has done something or said something that has made me upset, sort of thing.
What I'm getting at is that we are constantly trying to infer the internal state of other people all the time. We're constantly trying to figure out, like, if someone uses a certain series of words that could have two different meanings, and you're an anxious person, say, or you're on the lookout for someone hurting you, or on the lookout for someone abandoning you, or anything like that, you might be like, if there is a version of interpretation where that's the case, and there's actually the interpretation that everyone else would have, which is not that, and that was a joke or whatever, you've perceived that to be the worst possible scenario. And because you can never actually tell the internal state of another person's mind, you can never tell what their intentions are. We're constantly trying to read other people's intentions and infer their intentions from the data we gather. And it seems like, different types of trauma, anxiety, depression, BPD, they sort of warp our perception of the world so that we're more likely to, this is my very basic understanding of it, but from what you said, we're more likely to strongly infer a negative spin where, maybe there was a 10% chance that that's what a person meant, but most people would just push that aside and go, that's not what they meant. Whereas we would infer, someone might infer a negative spin, and then they go on a spiral of paranoia or a spiral of an anger or a spiral, whatever emotional state. And it was because their perception was interrupted, or their perception was inaccurate or whatever, and they can't help that because what can you only ever experience the world through perception. That is the only way you experience the world.
A lot of what you've said resonates with me and how I feel, and what I mean, you're someone that doesn't have BPD, but it's very nice to hear that you kind of get to some extent the sort of scenarios that might happen, even if it's just day-to-day stuff.
No, I think it's really interesting. I mean, what you were mentioning there as well, Luke, is that sort of spiral from something that you've perceived. What I find interesting there is when we talk about emotional instability, we're not just talking about sort of negative emotions. So, I mean, it says here, you could experience a range of often intense negative emotions like rage, sorrow, shame, panic, terror, long-term feelings of emptiness and loneliness. You could have severe mood swings over a short period of time, but it's also common to feel really, really low and then fine just a little bit later. So, the next day, you're like, I'm fine now. Or in the evening, you're feeling horrible in the morning, and then the evening, you're like, I'm feeling great again. I'm feeling so...
It's actually mad. The mood swings are mad. I cannot even... do you know what, though? When I was ever in a really, really low place, and, here's the thing, think of the lowest that you've felt and then go further, is what I would often say to people about, how low I could feel. And I didn't even think it was possible to feel that low. It's actually almost, painful, how... it's excruciating feeling that down. But it's so weird how I could just maybe be like, I've got to pick up the phone and talk to someone. And within the first few minutes, my mood is back up again.
Just fine again. Yeah. And it's insane. It's you're experiencing things so intensely, right? So for example, I mean, I don't think it's abnormal to feel a bit sad and then kind of be fine a little bit later. I mean, look, maybe this is the ADHD talking as well, where it's I have impermanence of my emotions. I'm like, oh man, I'm feeling horrible. Anyway, Sims. Oh, cool. I'm feeling good again.
Like a goldfish going around in a circle.
Yeah. It's like
well, that's a nice castle.
I forgot that I was feeling bad, and so then I wasn't anymore.
Sure.
And then I remembered that I was feeling bad. I'm like, oh, that was dumb. No, but I mean, so what I'm trying to say here is that I kind of get this sort of moving from one thing to another, but what's so interesting to me here about BPD is just the sheer intensity of emotion, because that's, I mean, what you're saying here kind of obviously correlates with what I've been reading, and it's just it's just these sort of high highs, low lows, intense relationships with people. And I mean, once we get into the sort of causes, it kind of starts to make a bit more sense. It's kind of interesting, but There's also disturbed patterns of thinking. So different types of thoughts can affect different people with BPD. But you can have upsetting thoughts. So this says like sort of such as thinking you're a terrible person or feeling you don't exist.
I used to call BPD bad person disorder. Oh, that's so bad because I felt like a bad person the whole time.
What's interesting again about BPD is that it's one of those things like sort of narcissistic personality disorder where it is not really discussed in terms of the people who have it. More so it's discussed by and about the people who live with around the people that have it, right?
It has a very negative stigma attached
yeah,
to it.
absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely a stigma. Yeah. And I think it's far better to look at this from the internal perspective rather than the external, because look, mental illness can make you treat people not very nice. That doesn't mean that you're a bad person necessarily. I mean, you could still be someone with BPD and be a bad person. I don't know, you could be a billionaire. That's not my business. But my point is that sort of viewing people with this subset of sort of mental illnesses or personality disorders or any sort of thing like this as being generally bad people or red flags or people to avoid, bro, that's not cool. That's like just like ableism. It's not nice. It's pretty horrid. And like, it can, obviously it can be difficult to be raised by or to live with someone that say got narcissistic personality disorder. But on the other hand, like, they can't help that, and it's our sort of duty, I would say, as just people to help to help people that to help people in that sort of position. So like, yeah, there is definitely a stigma, and we should try to reduce that. But yeah, so brief episodes of strange experiences, like hearing voices outside your head for minutes at a time.
I don't hear a lot.
Oh my God, I forgot your death. I forgot your death. Before we started recording, by the way, we were doing levels, and Luke was like, "Hey Elliot, can you laugh as loud as you can?" And Elliot proper screamed into the mic and then said,
I forgot that other people can hear a lot. Something like that.
I forgot people can hear more than I can.
There we go. Yeah.
Good Lord. So there's also prolonged episodes of abnormal experiences, so sort of hallucinations, auditory, visual, and distressing beliefs that no one can talk you out of, like like delusions, basically. I mean, it says here, this is what's really difficult, is that I feel a little bit odd about saying these specific things because I don't want to set anyone off. To be clear, these are not, if you're thinking these things, it is almost certain that it is not the case, right? So, for example, it says here, like, for example, thinking that your family are secretly trying to kill you. I can guarantee you that they are not.
You can't guarantee. You can almost.
I can almost guarantee you that, to be honest, if the one single person that this might actually be the case for, no,
I was going to say, often the examples that they give, for example, like your family is out to kill you, like I find are quite extreme examples. Like I didn't really experience any sort of like hallucinogenic type,
like sort of delusion,
that kind of thing. I got intrusive thoughts and very intense intrusive thoughts. It would be things like pushing people in the road and stuff, and like I would never obviously act on it, but like it was a very horrible thought to like have in your brain.
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
The annoying thing about intrusive thoughts at this point is that they're another thing like gaslighting, like what's the word, dissociation, that TikTok and teenagers now have taken and decided that intrusive thought just means a thought that you think and you're like, oh, that's a bit weird. Like me fighting the intrusive thought to cut my hair. That's an impulsive decision.
People saying things like that?
I swear to God, people are saying things like that. Like, oh my God, me fighting the intrusive thoughts to cut bangs. Cutting a fringe is not an intrusive thought. That's an impulse. Everyone has impulses. An intrusive thought is when something pops into your head that is very much not you.
Yeah, and you have to separate yourself. I had a massive thing about telling myself to separate. I felt like my head and my heart were in completely different places. For example, my head was, sorry, this is like a trigger warning here, and I'm gonna mention, wanting to unalive yourself, but my head would be telling me to, unalive myself, and I had to really rationalize and go, what does my heart actually want? Because my heart has never wanted anything more than to love and share good, positive things with everyone around me. And how could my head be so opposed to that and say something the complete opposite? And it always feels so much louder, I guess, especially because it's a negative thing, like it can feel like it's
Yeah,
heavy.
Do you know? I'll say this from the outside. All we're hearing is your heart. I'm not even joking. I mean, this might apply to others too, but speaking from someone that knows you, I think if anyone were to describe you, they would describe you based on what you just said your heart wants, as someone who just wants to sort of love and make nice things happen in the world.
My heart is normally in the right place, and sometimes my head will think things, or like I'll have an intense reaction without like an almost like I'm not even thinking about it, and I have a reaction and I react out of how I'm feeling. And it's hard to then have to go, no, that it's not that wasn't me, but it was me, and I can apologize and take accountability for my actions, or like responding in a defensive way, right? But I do have to also recognize what my heart actually wants, and that's what helps me come to the processing part. Do you know what I mean?
No. Yeah. And I mean,
I feel like that can apply to things outside of BPD as well.
I've heard that described as ego dystonic, and it's to do with thoughts, I think, and intrusive thoughts, things like that. It's to do with there are thoughts that do not match with yourself, like your sense of self, and the sort of danger, I suppose, is that you expand your ego, being like your sense of self and who you are and your identity. And if you were to try to expand your sense of self to incorporate your ego dystonic thoughts, you're then going like, oh gosh, maybe I'm a murderer. Oh, maybe that's just who I am, even though no evidence in the actual world
it took
backs
me
that
a long
up.
time.
It's just the thoughts, and they're ego dystonic thoughts. They are thoughts that are there that are almost a complete inverse of who you are.
It felt like it was the exact opposite.
Yeah.
It's like, why? As well, it's so frustrating because it's like I don't want to be experiencing that.
But I think that most people that know you would very much describe you as the heart. Do you know what I mean? And so what I mean to say here is, for anyone that's listening, and also for you, even though you're not listening.
No, I'm not.
Why am I making that take? Anyway, no, but I think for anyone that knows you, they would not even really consider you as being what your head is telling you that you are. And
my wife thinks you're great. She's very she's very protective, and she susses people out and checks and but she thinks you're wonderful. She was literally, we saw you the other day and we were going home, and she was like, God, Elliot's just so wonderful. I just want to give him a big hug. I want to protect him. He's just the best. And she only really ever says that about Phoenix. So you're in the Phoenix camp.
No, I'm not nice for that.
My wife doesn't need to protect you, Corey. I think you're okay. I think you'll be okay.
But I mean, it's a lesson that's worth sort of, I guess, listening to, is that just because your head is telling you something, there is a solid chance that you're the only one that is not even thinking that, but aware of that, right? Because I think that most people that know you, maybe not know you as intimately as people that live with you or see you every single day, but like people that know you well, but not to that level, wouldn't even necessarily, I think, consider that. And I'm not just saying this for you. I mean, as I said, for anyone listening, like if something's going on in your head and you're telling yourself that you're this kind of person, literally try and talk to someone about it, because they will. The chances are it is just in your head. I
was going to say a lot of my healing with BPD has come from giving myself mantras, or like a phrase that would help me. So, for example, we talked about low moods. When I was in an extreme low mood, I was like, well, just as quickly as I can hit this low mood, I can get out of it. Because how quickly my moods can change. So if I do something that will help pull me out of that mood, distract my mind for a bit, I have the ability to maybe help myself.
I think that's interesting. So it's something that I wouldn't say learned in therapy. Something that I honed in therapy was just sitting and picking out something. Because I mean, I've always been a very, I guess, reflective person, right? I'll sit and I'll think about a thing. I mean, I was in the shower my phone died. I was in the shower the other day thinking for an hour, just thinking about myself. I was like, okay, let's start off. I was feeling this. Let's tease apart why I was feeling that. And then I get sidetracked because ADHD. But anyway, the thing is that if you try to understand where your feelings are coming from, where thoughts are coming from, and really, really be honest with yourself about patterns and whatnot, when you're feeling low, you'll be more equipped to pull yourself out of it. At this point, the only time that I really feel depressed is generally when I want to. And I know what that sounds like, but I mean, like, do you know when you're in that sort of really low depression mood and you're like, I want to feel this is how I should feel, like, or you don't have the drive to not do the things you know you should do to not feel like that. You're just like, I don't want to do anything, and so I will just feel like this. That's the only time that I'll ever feel depressed. If I have even the slightest drive to be able to do something, then the thing that I will be able to do is just sort of start to pull myself out of it by, I guess, tracing back those patterns and being like, okay, yeah, so you're feeling anxious about your career. Okay, right, well, look at all of these things. Shut up. Okay, let's move on. It's like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's...
Brilliant.
Like, literally, it's always like sitting in...
This is like when you forget that you have friends.
Oh my God, I hate that.
And no one makes you write a list of your friends.
No, that doesn't happen. I've got pictures of all my friends on the wall.
That's why you have the pictures on the wall.
There's a happy accident. Yeah. But it's almost like, a kid comes crying to you, and it just starts crying about irrational stuff, and you got to be very patient, and because they're a child.
Well, it's called parenting yourself.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
That is a literal technique that I found kind of helpful, is to think of yourself as, imagine what you're feeling now, like what's going through your head. Imagine that was younger you, maybe it's like 8-year-old you, and you're like, 8-year-old you was feeling that. You'd be knowing what 8-year-old you was going through as well, maybe at the time as well, you'd be so much kinder to yourself, and then you'd need to apply how you're nurturing and looking after this 8-year-old's feelings and apply that to you.
Do you know about transactional analysis? Do either of you have transactional analysis? Do you know about this? No.
Look, you talk about it constantly.
We need to do a whole episode.
You said this
it's just an episode request. It's relevant to what you're talking about, but it's too much to get into now, I think.
Do an episode on it then.
Me?
Yeah, do one.
Oh God, that's a lot of pressure. Oh, Uno reverse carded me there, didn't you, Corey?
Ding-a-ling-ling, is that the ad bell?
Hark the ad bell, he does sing.
He sings for Patreon, I think. If you head over to our Patreon at patreon.com/SCI GUYS, you can get a whole host of cool things. What can they get, Luke?
Oh, bloomin' heck. They can get so many things. There's bonus episodes. You can request topics for episodes. There's an entire other show called After Dark where we discuss sort of philosophical things and just general discussion, the kind of stuff that you imagine we talk about after we've finished recording. Well, that is when we do it, so that is what we do. And lots of other stuff. What else is there?
You get your name at the end of every single SCI GUYS episode. You can also vote on topics. You get to choose what we do. And at the end of the episode that's voted on by our patrons, if it's your first month being a patron, you get thanked by name by us, the SCI GUYS. Isn't that fun?
That is really fun. I'll use my vocal cords to say your name with a 50% probability because Corey says half of them.
That's very true. So head to our Patreon at patreon.com/SCI GUYS. Something that I think is kind of relevant to this discussion is that I think to be mentally healthy for some people, it takes quite a bit of work, right? And unfortunately, this is kind of similar to the episode that we did a few weeks ago when we spoke about prisons. Unfortunately, sometimes doing the best thing to do, the thing that is the healthiest thing to do, the thing that will, cause the most good, that will improve things the most, is the one that does not feel nice and is not fun. And isn't like isn't what you feel like you should be doing. So, for example, right, like, to pull yourself out of being depressed, or to kind of regulate your emotions better, or to like kind of, I guess, be nicer to yourself. Sometimes it involves sitting and looking at yourself and saying, "I'm feeling this way," and sure, feelings are valid, but also, you've got to kind of be like, okay, well, me feeling this way is hurting me and other people. I need to deal with this better. And I think that sort of transactional analysis that you're talking about, the sort of parenting yourself, is a really good way of doing that, because it is. You've got to kind of got to basically be a parent, firm but understanding. You can't be horrible to yourself, but you have got to have that sort of firmness to be like, okay, here is what you need to do, because being mentally healthy is really bloody hard. It takes a lot of work. But getting back to BPD, let's talk about the impulsive behavior. So if you have BPD, there are too many types of impulses you might find extremely difficult to control. Now, I mean, again, there'll have been a trigger warning at the start of this, I assume, but impulse to self-harm, there's different ways of doing that. We're not going to get into it, but reckless and irresponsible activities like binge drinking, drug misuse, spending or gambling sprees, unstable relationships, sex with strangers, and if you have BPD, you might feel that people abandon you when you most need them, or that they get too close and smother you. So if you look at BPD, it's kind of a personality disorder of extremes, right? Like, okay, I feel like you've abandoned me, or I feel like you've smothered me. There's like this, there doesn't seem to be much in between, and the switching between them seems to be quite quick, right?
There's a lot of black and white thinking involved in, you know, it's very hard to tell yourself there's a grey area, and that's sort of another thing that I had to go through with myself. Don't get me wrong, I still BPD my life up sometimes, and like it's still very relevant to myself today, but it's, like there's a grey area in situations, and sometimes it's very hard to see outside of your feelings and like all of that and go, okay, one of the biggest things was going, what's the situation? Here it is. And try and see from the outside of perspective, not just from in here.
I think this is something that will help people with any relationship they've got. If you're ever in a situation where there's some disagreement with someone or there's some upset, the absolute best way forward every single time without fail is to start off from the position of, my perspective is not objective, and this other person's perspective is as equally valid as mine. Now, obviously, if you're dealing with someone who's abusive and all of that, and gaslighting and all, that's less the case. But someone's genuine, sincere perspective, you need to start off with it being kind of as valid as yours. Otherwise, you're going to really have difficulties when they say something that feels like it contradicts with what you experienced, right? I think, honestly, sort of interacting with people, these sort of healthy relationships, a lot of it has to do with being able to take a step back and looking at yourself and being like, I'm not perfect, and that's okay, but I need to be aware of it, right?
Big time. I know I'm not perfect. I know that I really know that I'm still, so long as you're still, I think, trying to be better than you were yesterday, I think that's always a good way to live. So.
Yeah. And then also, I mean, there's the two sides of that, like being like, oh, I'm not perfect, but also not beating yourself up into the...
I'm not perfect!
Oh!
Why am I not perfect?
But yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about this sort of, what happens when there's sort of this fear of abandonment, right? So it can lead to, it says, anxiety and anger, and result in behaviors like texting and phoning someone constantly, suddenly calling someone in the middle of the night, physically clinging on to someone and refusing to let go, making threats to harm yourself if the person left you. Yeah. I was not reading ahead.
See, because I knew that was something that was used as an example for people with BPD. Like, I've never done that to someone because it doesn't morally sit right with me that you would threaten to your life if they leave you. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't agree with it, so I never did it, but I can understand if you have such an intense fear of being abandoned that you want to do anything to make that person stay. You might not. For
some people, it could literally be the truth for them in their head. Do you know what I mean? Like,
I was going to say, not everything that your head tells you is true, or like, do you know what I mean? Like, with thoughts as well.
Absolutely. And then the other side of that is feeling like you're being smothered, which could then just result in you withdrawing completely or trying to drive people away, right? Like, this is I think this is really interesting to me, because you understand what it's kind of, I guess it kind of then makes more sense why it's called borderline personality disorder, in that, like, there's not one consistent thing. You know, with depression, it's like you feel depressed, you are low all the time. With BPD, it's like you are low, nah, you're high, now you're low, you are feeling smothered. Get people closer to you because they are going to leave you. Like, it, like that. It's like really reading this.
It's like it's
right.
That's why everyone with BPD it's so different. I know so many people who have been like, I have BPD and I struggle with these things, but I don't struggle with that. I used to be someone that had like 8 of the 9 criteria that's like on the NHS website or whatever. And the one that I didn't have was anger, like an intense like anger, because I just didn't see myself as an angry person.
Yeah.
But then actually I do struggle with anger more now,
Yeah.
but I don't struggle with any of the other symptoms anywhere near as much as I used to.
And it's interesting how that can change, right? I mean, we'll get into this when we get more to the causes, but it seems that BPD is less one of those things of, this is just the way that I am wired, and I have been wired from the start, and more, like you were saying, a sort of very deep-seated pattern of how you interact with the world, right? Like, I mean, because, you know, kids are constantly learning all the time. Like, they're forming connections in their brain, they're reinforcing those connections. And if you're taught to interact with the world in a certain way, it's going to be really difficult to change that. But then also, so for example, in your case, as you get older, as the world changes around you, as you change, the things that you struggle with can change too, right? It's interesting, and it's worth sort of considering and looking into. So I mean, if we talk if we go a little bit further into this sort of abandonment and I guess sort of, what's the word, the sort of fear of abandonment and also fear of being smothered, it goes on to say that those two patterns could have like a sort of, could result in sort of like an unstable love-hate type relationship where it's very like hot and cold, on and off, right? So it literally says here, you were saying there's a black and white view. The NHS says many people with BPD seem to be stuck in a very rigid black-white view of relationships. Either it's perfect and the person's wonderful, or it's doomed and the person is terrible. So there's no gray area. It's either this is the best relationship ever, we're going to be together until the world ends, or you are terrible, this will never work, I hate you, get away from me, right? Like there's no
where's the gray area? You need it. I knew someone that had a mental sort of I don't know, check like a mental check of who was in their good books and who was in their bad books, and you would either be in the bad or you would be in the good. There was no in between for this person. This is someone I knew who had BPD or has BPD, and yeah, I ended up in the bad books a couple of times, but like
yeah,
very
and it's hard, right? Because it's like, well, as a sort of acquaintance or a friend of someone, how do you go about dealing with that? Because okay, well, I get that it's not your fault necessarily, this is how you are experiencing things, but also I need to protect myself in some way, and it's a really difficult sort of balancing act of like, okay, I'm going to be there for you, but not at too much expense of myself, right? Like that's a really difficult line to walk, and especially for someone that's going to that feels emotions very strongly and has a fear of abandonment, driving people away and getting what you want is only going to exacerbate, like, it's like, okay, yeah, I was right, they will just leave me, like, do you know what I mean? But you've driven them away because that's what you wanted. It's one of those sort of self-fulfilling prophecy sort of thing.
Would it be fair to say that, like, so it occurs to me when you were saying about viewing things in black and white, it feels like
he means colorblind. Everyone BPD is colorblind.
So it occurs to me, I don't know if this is accurate at all, but it occurs to me that if somebody with BPD is coming to like black and white conclusions about things, or dealing with things in black and white, sorry, this is my way of describing the world. Sometimes sounds weird to people because I sound like a robot when I describe things. But so you're taking in information about the world, and so, for example, I imagine I'm interacting with you, and I might think Elliot is 20% devious, and then I might think he's 60% friendly, right? But if I'm dealing with the world in black and whites, I would round that 60% up to 100%, and I would round the 20% down to 0%, right? And it occurs to me that if you do that with quite a few things, and then you try to come to a conclusion about something, that conclusion is going to seem irrational because it hasn't taken into account. It's not even that the conclusion is black and white. It's that every step along the way, if every step along the way is black and white, you're going to come to a completely
just skewed
like
results.
rounding errors is what you're talking about.
It's like rounding errors compounded upon rounding errors compounded on. Now, I'm not saying that's just a thought I had. It's nothing to do with BPD necessarily.
Oh, no, I get you. I mean, just to sort of illuminate it for anyone sort of listening, right? If you think about this, right, you round 5. If you're rounding up to the nearest 10, you'd round 5 up to 10, right? You'd round, if you're rounding in, then you'd probably have to then round 4 down to 0, right?
Yep.
If you're rounding to the nearest 10, including zeros, right?
Yeah.
Or let's say you're rounding to the nearest 10, right? Up or down. 5 would be rounded up to 15 would be rounded up to 20.
Yeah.
14 would be rounded down to 10.
Yeah.
Now, if you're multiplying 15 by 14 like over and over and over,
Yeah.
if you've got that rounding thing, you've got a very different result than...
Yeah, your end result
Like,
is like...
it's very far off.
It might be orders of magnitude off from the actual result. And
Yeah.
so that's... But I don't know if that's anything to do with it. But like that feels like... If there were like
I feel
stages
like black and white thinking is often a result of is a reactionary thing. So like, I'll give you the example of like the person with the "you're in my good books, you're in my bad books" kind of thing. We had a receptionist at the foyer that we used to live at, and they would be like, "Oh, she's in my good books today," or "she's in my bad books today," and the bad books would very rarely ever happen because she was like our favourite receptionist, so we'd always go down and see her. This is when I lived in like a halfway homeless place before uni, but occasionally this person would turn around to me and be like, "Oh, she's in my bad books today," and it's like, well, something must have happened in order. Like I often feel like the black and white thinking is a result of something happening, and then that's, I get like you're saying like this is how you perceive the situation, so that's, but I feel like,
I think what Luke's saying is that like something will happen, and because of the way that you've sort of perceived it, because of the sort of black and white thinking, right? Instead of thinking that maybe, you know, oh, this was a little odd for that person to sort of say something that way, you'd go to the they did this on purpose and how fucking dare they sort of thing. Like it's less a case of like, you know, oh, I just perceive something differently, and someone does something, and how you interpret that, it's either 0 or 100, right? There's no sort of middle ground. There's no sort of gray area. It's just this was good, or this was good interaction or bad interaction. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So what I mean is okay, so put this in the real world. So imagine you were talking about somebody putting someone in good books and bad books. So imagine you put someone in the bad books.
Yeah.
And then you have an interaction with that person, and because they're in your bad books, you act rudely to them. Fair enough, they're in your bad books. And then they react rudely to you. And that's sort of fair enough too, because you reacted rudely to them, and your rude reaction was a result of your black and white putting them in the bad books.
Yeah.
Now you and them now have a legitimate falling out, right?
Yeah.
And they do something else that impacts you in another way. And you put them even more in the bad books, and then you react even bigger, and
Kind of like a feedback loop.
And at every stage, your judging of the situation is either black or white, right? It's not in the middle, right? At every stage. Now imagine that's happening inside your head, and that every interaction and every piece of information you receive has been judged black or white. The end result is going to be so much different than if you were using shades of grey at every stage of the equation, right? And that's all I mean, is that might then lead to it magnifies and magnifies and magnifies more every single time there's any judgment that's black and white. Does that make sense?
Black and white thinking is like really in therapy is addressed. You know, when I did DBT, like they'd often talk about like judgments that you pass on things. You know, you make a split decision on something, and how, you know, you just, a lot of it was to do with like processing those thoughts, and as we've already explained, like inner reflection and stuff.
Thank you very much for that. But let's get into the diagnosis, right? And something you may have been picking up on earlier is that there seems to be a bit of overlap between BPD and bipolar disorder and CPTSD, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or depression, anxiety, psychosis, or antisocial personality disorder. I mean, I would also say there seems to be overlap between BPD and unmedicated, untreated, undiagnosed ADHD. Like I was looking at some of these things and I was like, wait, am I going to find out that I have BPD just like I found out that I had ADHD through doing this podcast? And then we read a little farther and I was like, oh, that is not me. Like there's some parts of this that I was feeling, oh, this is very much. And then we read a little farther and I was like, oh, no, actually no. But I think that's an interesting thing to bring up because, you know, that's obviously showing that it's kind of difficult to get a BPD diagnosis, and it's kind of difficult to get diagnosed correctly. I mean, even the NHS will say that that it's very easy to get the wrong diagnosis. There's a whole bit about sort of misdiagnosis. I can read this verbatim. It says, there are many reasons why you may experience challenges with getting a BPD diagnosis, including getting the wrong diagnosis. The symptoms of BPD are very broad and some can be similar to or overlap with other mental health problems. And yeah, it is something that is difficult to get diagnosed sort of correctly with. There's also the fact that people don't experience pain or emotions in the same way. And so that's another added layer of complexity. And it literally says because of this, you could not get, you might not get a diagnosis of BPD when you feel like you should have one, get a diagnosis of a different mental health problem which you don't agree with, get a BPD diagnosis when you feel like you should have a different diagnosis, and get a BPD diagnosis when you feel like you shouldn't have a diagnosis at all. Let's just quickly run through the diagnostic criteria before we, touch on sort of the causes. So the diagnostic criteria are pretty straightforward, it seems. So it says a pervasive pattern of instability of interpersonal relationships, self-image and affects, and a marked impulsivity beginning in early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts, as indicated by 5 or more of the following: frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment, a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation, identity disturbance, markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self, impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging, so spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating, recurrent unaliving oneself behavior, gestures or threats, or self-harm, affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood, so intense episodic dysphoria, irritability or anxiety, usually lasting a few hours and only rarely more than a few days. Essentially what it's saying here is that, instability and sort of very unstable moods, chronic feelings of emptiness, inappropriate intense anger or difficulty controlling anger, constant anger, recurrent physical fights, transient stress-related paranoid ideation, or severe dissociative symptoms. So it is very broad. It seems like a catch-all. If we're talking about all the other things we're talking about on SCI GUYS, it seems like a catch-all for those, right? Which makes sense as to why 1, it's very hard to sort of diagnose, 2, it's very hard to deal with, and 3, there is so much stigma around it because no one seems to actually know what it is.
And it affects people so widely different.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to blast through the treatment. You've spoken a little bit about yours already, so I'm just going to quickly just run through what sort of the possibilities here are. So, there's lots of different sort of therapies. You could have a community mental health team sort of support through them. You can have a sort of kind of assisted living, I guess. So sort of living basically in an inpatient facility in certain periods can help during specific episodes, right? There's art therapy, sort of music therapy, DBT, so it's dialectical behavior therapy. I think you mentioned that you had that.
Yeah, what I had. There's not really too much to say about DBT, to be honest. I don't think I was in the right place at the time to be doing it either. I didn't fully understand what they were expecting of me. And that made the treatment quite difficult. So
just to quickly touch on DBT, it's essentially based on 2 concepts. Dialectics, which is a sort of school of philosophy that says that things are rarely black and white. There's shades of grey, basically, is what that's on about. And validation, accepting that your emotions are valid, real, and acceptable. So it's this sort of thing like, I'm feeling this way. That is valid. It is not bad that I am feeling what I am feeling. Things are not necessarily as black and white as I am feeling they are. There are shades of grey. I am not bad for feeling this way, but that does not necessarily mean that my feelings are a objective sort of interpretation of reality, let's say, right? And again, that's what I was talking about earlier. It's a really difficult thing to sort of coach yourself through, because you're kind of fighting against yourself whilst also trying to be kind to yourself. And it's very easy to be too kind to yourself and be like, everything I'm feeling is absolutely valid and true and correct, and everyone else is wrong. And it's also very easy to be really horrible to yourself and be like, I am absolutely wrong and crazy, and my feelings are not valid, and everything I've ever felt is wrong. And neither of those things are going to help you. It's that middle ground of feelings are valid, doesn't necessarily mean that they're objective, Balance, exactly. And there's something called mentalization-based therapy. That's a long-term psychotherapy, basically based in the concept that apparently people with BPD have a poor capacity to mentalize, which is sort of thinking about thinking, that sort of meta thought process, right? So looking into your own thoughts and beliefs and thinking whether they're useful, realistic, and based in reality. Basically what I do in my brain all the time.
You say people with BPD do that a lot?
The BPD have a poor capacity, it says.
Right.
Yeah,
so this sort of metacognition, self-referential
thought. That sort of reflective thinking about the thoughts that you're having, I guess. Kind of what we were talking about earlier, realistically. Therapeutic communities is kind of what I was touching on earlier with the sort of inpatient ideas. Now, that's structured environments where people with a range of complex psychological conditions and needs come together to interact and take part in therapy. It's not necessarily like an inpatient facility. It could be. So most TCs are residential, such as in large houses where you stay for around 1 to 4 days a week, right? So it's, kind of living in an environment that is much more stable and, kind of helping coach you through dealing with that. And again, we've spoken about this. People with BPD are not a monolith, right? There's different experiences, and that doesn't mean that's not to say that everyone, not saying Elliot, go ahead and live in a therapeutic community because that's what you should do because you've got BPD.
I think that also means when it comes to treatment for BPD, you have to, for example, I used to be on medication, so I used to be on sertraline. That didn't work. I was trying citalopram for a bit. That didn't make me feel good. I tried fluoxetine for a bit, and then I had an experience that was like an unalive experience, and very actually happy that it wasn't successful. Very happy about that. But it's 2 months after that I got my BPD diagnosis, because I'd only just turned 18 at the time, and they wouldn't, even if I'd been for mental health things before, they were adamant they didn't want to diagnose someone under the age of 18 with BPD. I can't remember what the reason for it is, but after that I decided not to have medication because I wanted to just try and see if I could coach myself through it, essentially.
Well, that's fair. Mood stabilizers, those sort of antidepressants can exacerbate things a lot.
Or they can really help someone. And that's the whole thing. It's just like with BPD, you're never going to know what treatment is right. And so as exhausting as it is to try all of the options, sometimes that's what you have to do, I guess.
No, absolutely. So, just before we finish off, let's just talk about sort of the causes. And to be very broad, we could talk about, sort of genetics, brain chemistry, all of that. So there is some evidence that there is some kind of genetic component to BPD. There's been some twin studies. It says here, a study found that if one identical twin had BPD, then there was a 2 in 3 chance that the other would also have BPD. Now, bear in mind, there's
difficult.
Yeah, there's no BPD
been raised
gene
together.
Yes. They were likely to be raised together or to go through the same sort of experiences there, right? But yeah, so you could be more vulnerable to BPD depending on genetics. But on top of that, there's brain chemistry. So there's the idea that as with most of these sort of disorders that we're talking about, there's a neurotransmitter that your brain just doesn't do so good. So in this case, people with BPD, we think that there might be something wrong with serotonin in the brain. There's all of that, but then there's what I would really say is sort of the main bit, which is the problems with brain development and environmental factors. And I'm grouping those together where they wouldn't necessarily be grouped together because I kind of think of them as being almost the same thing, right? So, it says here that researchers have used MRIs to study the brains of people with BPD, and that kind of shows that there are 3 different parts of the brain that were smaller than expected or had sort of unexpected levels of activity. So the amygdala, which kind of controls sort of negative emotions, sort of fight or flight, and also regulates emotions, like
That's
fear,
interesting.
aggression, anxiety. Yeah. The hippocampus, which helps regulate behavior and self-control, and the orbital frontal cortex, which is involved in planning and decision making. So these, you can see how these three parts of the brain,
I'm just like, oh gosh, yeah, okay, that's so interesting,
right? And then it says these parts of the brain, the sort of development of your brain, is heavily influenced by your early upbringing, which is what I was getting at earlier, right? So as a child, your brain is growing and developing. You are making connections in your brain all the time. That's how your brain works, by connections, and those connections are strengthened the more they're used. That's why it's, you can get into a habit and it's hard to break out of a habit, but you can accidentally fall into a habit just by kind of doing the same thing again and again. But once you've been doing that again and again, it's really hard to break out of it. So if your early upbringing led you to sort of have to act in a particular way, then it makes sense that that would then be carried throughout your life. So it says here that these parts of your brain are also responsible for mood regulation, which may account for some of the problems people with BPD have in close relationships. And it goes on to say that there are environmental factors that seem to be common and widespread amongst people with BPD. Basically, being victims of abuse, or being exposed to long-term fear or distress as a child, and bad things happening in your childhood, basically, right? Which makes sense as the link to sort of CPTSD, and a few of these sort of other things going on there, or antisocial personality disorder, which we kind of covered a little bit in our episode on oppositional defiant disorder, right? Basically, the sort of takeaway from this, if you want to understand kind of what BPD is, from my understanding, it seems to be that it's a case of having potentially maybe a genetic proclivity, but generally the through line is a sort of disordered early upbringing, right? That kind of, and the way that the way that this is sort of different for lots of different people. To me, it seems that this is a case of having a specific upbringing that gears you towards engaging with the world in this specific way, and having that be so deeply ingrained that you need to spend a lot of conscious effort and energy trying to think yourself out of what you naturally sort of do.
Absolutely. That is, like you've just described to a T, kind of my last 6 years of my life. Like, basically, like that, that event, that I was talked about happened just before I was 18. I'm about to be 24 in March. And like the last few years have been just very long, but yeah, exactly that. Trying to go, okay, when a situation happens, when this thing happens, how do I react? Okay, I react this way, and this way is not a positive way to react. So instead of my brain jumping from this to this, which always results in this, trying to change, okay, maybe I take 5 seconds before I say something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. And try and change that brain's immediate jump to the thing.
Pull yourself out of what is essentially like a habit, right?
But it's so hard to do. And I can understand how people with BPD get really stuck in cycles of being that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the same as, not exactly the same, but I think it's like sort of almost any sort of trauma, right? You learn to, and I don't just mean learn as in cognitively learn, consciously learn rather, learn in a much deeper underlying sense, right? You learn to engage with the world in this way because that is what keeps you safe. That's what keeps you going. And then that's maladaptive, right? And in a sort of, say, turbulent or tumultuous childhood, in reacting in these ways may protect you or may make you feel better in some ways. But becoming an adult, man, the behavior of a sort of an abused child is very maladaptive as an adult, right? Like, you can't go through your life acting in the way that one would as a child in that situation. And I think that's something that ties together a few disorders, right? That, like, it's essentially you are acting in this way that is considered sort of disordered, or is antisocial, mostly based on just that being the way that you had to be or learned to be or were forced to be based on your upbringing. But yeah, I mean, like, if we talk about sort of treatment of BPD, all of these sort of things, I don't think that BPD is necessarily one of those things that we're just going to be dealing with forever. Do you know what I mean? I don't think it's something sort of like depression or anxiety. I mean, there do seem to be people that are, you know, sort of more prone to it, and you know, maybe there will always be like some number of people in the population who have BPD, but like from this, it seems to be that it very heavily is a result of trauma in childhood, right? And that's almost a good thing, in that it means that we can help people much more effectively, right? In that, by trying to stomp out the cause initially, right? The initial thing that leads people, the root cause. But then also being more conscious of that, because even whilst that's happening, if you're able to help a child out of these patterns before they become like fully ingrained by the time they reach adulthood, right? You're like, okay, sure, this isn't a case of like stopping people from having BPD, but you're just gonna have more people who are more equipped to deal with the world without having to go through all of that.
It's not even just that, giving people a skill set.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, okay, in this situation, this is the best way to respond to it. Yeah. So yeah, no, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you know, I mean, just as a sort of last thing, you say skill set there, it just really makes me think of like ADHD. I'm sorry to even tie it back, but it is just like, well, this is the way that I work now, and I just need to figure out ways of making this work with the world that I'm in, right? So yeah, you're not a bad person.
No.
So if you've got BPD, you're not a bad person. You're just someone who needs to put maybe a bit of extra work into thinking about how you think and how you react. And that's basically it for BPD. That's our episode for this week. I have one last thing though.
Uh-oh.
It's a quickfire quiz.
Dun 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 dun. BPD edition.
The rules for the quickfire quiz are the same as always. I'll ask one question. That's one question between the two of you. The first person to buzz in with the correct answer wins. What do they win, Luke?
Some therapy.
And what is your buzzer, Luke?
Therapy.
And what is your buzzer?
Oh.
So the question for you is, what does BPD stand for?
Therapy.
Damn, Luke really wants that therapy. Luke, what is your answer?
Borderline personality disorder.
And that is what Elliot's got, and that is what you are stopping him from getting therapy for.
Oh, I'm
with
so
your
sorry.
selfishness.
I took your therapy.
Well, that is all from us this week. Thank you very much for watching. Before we go, we'd like to thank all of our patrons with an extra special thank you to executive producers Danito and Glitchrabbit. And again, thank you for watching. You can find the full references for this episode down in the description. Subscribe to new episodes every Sunday, and why not leave us a nice wee comment? You can support the pod at patreon.com/SciGuys, or you can find and contact us at SciGuysPod on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and at SciGuys on TikTok too. Or you can send us an email at sciguyspod@gmail.com.
That's sciguyspod@gmail.com.
SciGuysPod
at gmail.com. You can follow me at Nalcari everywhere.
You can follow me at Luke Cutforth everywhere.
And you can follow me at Evolution of Elliot everywhere.
Goodbye.
Go away. Get out of my house.
Shoot.
No, come back.
No. Leave.